The history of World War I plays a fundamental role in how different countries across the world develop a collective memory and conception of themselves as a nation. November 11th, Remembrance Day, is widely recognized as a date for reflecting and strengthening collective memory surrounding World War I, but it is also a day where deep social contradictions momentarily come to the surface. What is the purpose of remembering World War I? Are we supposed to be honoring the brave heroism and sacrifice of soldiers who fought and died for a higher cause? Or are we supposed to be reflecting on the irrationalism and absurdity of 20 million people killed in World War I, as well as those who continue to be killed in wars fought today? The deepest roots of this contradiction are in how we as a society come to develop a collective memory around histories such as World War I. In capitalist societies, where news, history books, films, and television shows are controlled by capital, the histories consumed on a mass scale are those produced through the perspective of the capitalist class. There may be much to learn about history through capitalist media, but as a general tendency, it will not produce narratives or histories that fundamentally challenge the capitalist system. A major consequence of having such great corporate and monopoly control over the social means of communication is seen in the development of profound ideological contradiction and irrationalism in our collective memory of World War I. The popular narrative regarding the causes of World War I suggests that a powder keg combination of nationalism, militarism, and strategic alliances exploded in the outbreak of the war, which was sparked by the assassination of the Archduke of Austria. How exactly this led to such mass destruction and the death of 20 million people across Europe is often questioned but rarely answered. If war is politics by other means, then our memory of World War I is highly political, and the bourgeois attack that has been waged against it needs to be contested with a counter-narrative that points the blame for World War I directly at those in power. Throughout the 19th century, the world underwent rapid changes as industrial capitalism spread across Europe. The discovery of coal, the invention of the steam engine, and the development of large-scale machinery and factories ushered in the modern era of mass commodity production. Large-scale machinery unleashed productive capacities never before seen in the history of humanity by intensifying the exploitation of workers. European workers labored for entire days. Women and children performed dangerous factory labor, while the poor and unemployed were criminalized and virtually enslaved in the prisons and workhouses. Throughout this period, even in the face of mass poverty, starvation, and destitution among the working class, the capitalist class grew extraordinarily wealthy and used their newfound wealth to expand this system of exploitation. The deprived condition of the workers gave rise to widespread resistance to the economic system, with the sharpest criticism of this period emerging from Karl Marx and his lifelong collaborator, Friedrich Engels. As a revolutionary, but also the son of a bourgeois factory owner, Engels occupied a unique social position that plainly revealed these contradictions to him. The bourgeoisie has gained a monopoly of all means of existence, in the broadest sense of the word. What the proletarian needs, he can obtain only from this bourgeoisie, which is protected in its monopoly by the power of the state. The proletarian is, therefore, in law and in fact, the slave of the bourgeoisie, which can decree his life or death. For the bourgeoisie, nothing exists in this world except for the sake of money, itself not excluded. It knows no bliss other than rapid gain, no pain other than losing gold. Enraged by the mass suffering endured by the working class under the exploitation of capital, Marx and Engels set out to dismantle the capitalist system by first laying bare the economic law of motion of modern society. Marx discovered that under the capitalist mode of production, wealth is generated by the social labor of the proletarian class, but is privately consumed by individuals within the capitalist class. The capitalist class consumes the value produced by labor by reinvesting it back into the process of production in the form of machines, more raw materials, or more workers. Individual capitalists within the capitalist class compete with one another for a greater share in the surplus value generated by social labor, with each pursuing the goal of taking over a larger share of the market. Marx and Engels were horrified to discover the extent to which the capitalist class was willing to exploit and oppress the working class in the name of endless profit and surplus value. Capital has one single life impulse, the tendency to create value and surplus value, to make its constant factor, the means of production, absorb the greatest possible amount of surplus labor. Capital is dead labor that, vampire-like, only lives by sucking living labor, and lives the more labor it sucks. As each capitalist seeks to generate the greatest amount of surplus value by producing ever-increasing magnitudes of commodities, eventually the system enters into a general crisis of overproduction. When a crisis of overproduction occurs, larger, more profitable capitalists are able to sustain the crash easier than their smaller competitors, who are then consumed and taken over by larger industry. These larger competitors continue the process of expansion not only by monopolizing the market, but also by exporting their surplus product abroad. In Marx's time, he saw that England was the first European nation to become dominated by large industrial monopolies, and was producing far more commodities than what its population could consume by itself. England realized that it became necessary to export its surplus product and therefore became the leading proponent of free trade. In the latter half of the 19th century, domestic industries across Europe and North America became threatened by the cheap imports that England was shipping to their markets. Small domestic industry could not compete with the industrial monopolies of England. Therefore, nations across Europe began introducing a wave of trade barriers, or tariffs, that placed an import tax on foreign goods. By taxing imports, smaller domestic industries could avoid competition with England and grow their own industrial capacities. In the 1860s, for example, the US introduced tariffs on English steel imports, which allowed the US to develop its national steel industry without competition from England. By 1900, the US steel industry had become so large that even England began importing US steel. As the period of protectionism and tariff policies unfolded, European nations were able to develop their national industry. But as these industries grew and monopolized, they eventually ran into the same problems of overproduction that England had confronted decades earlier. By the turn of the 20th century, it wasn't just England looking to expand abroad, but many giant industrial monopolies scattered all across Europe and North America as well. As every European nation now found itself in a position of needing to export its surplus production, trade barriers were no longer a rational economic policy, and the era of free trade commenced. Marx and Engels saw free trade and the emergence of the global market in this historical context, understanding that it was a product of the capitalist tendency towards mass production and expansion. The system of protection was an artificial means of manufacturing manufacturers, of expropriating independent laborers, of capitalizing the national means of production and subsistence, and of forcibly abbreviating the transition from the medieval to the modern mode of production. One other thing must never be forgotten, namely, that just as everything has become a monopoly, there are also nowadays some branches of industry which dominate all others, and secure to the nations which most largely cultivate them the command of the world market. All the destructive phenomena which unlimited competition gives rise to within one country are reproduced in more gigantic proportions on the world market. As each industrial monopoly produced ever-increasing magnitudes of commodities, they required resources from larger and larger geographic territories. The capitalist class of each European empire came into conflict with one another in a scramble to secure different territories, resources, and markets as their own. This competition took the form of inter-imperialist rivalry and war between European empires, but also a broader focus towards colonizing the Third World. Just as the national market gave rise to monopoly capital and the bourgeois class, monopolies give rise to global competition and a uniquely capitalist form of colonialism. During this early period of global expansion, the logic of capital came to dominate state policies and cultivate the need for nationalism and militarism. Although the imperialist stage of monopoly capital does not have a concrete day of birth, the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 gave heightened expression to a vast set of contradictions. Historians generally agree that the Franco-Prussian War was largely caused by German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck stoking the flames of national chauvinism and pushing for war as a means of politically unifying Germany. However, France was not a simple victim of German provocation. It too saw the war as a necessary means of maintaining French Bonapartism in the face of German aggression. Louis Bonaparte had a track record of military success and ambitious goals to modernize France. Like Bismarck in Germany, Bonaparte in France saw the prospect of war as an opportunity to implement desired reforms and restructure society. The Franco-Prussian War saw the introduction of new military technologies, such as the bolt-action rifle, as well as the mass mobilization of over 3.5 million troops. Both of these factors resulted in a greatly heightened number of casualties, with roughly 900,000 soldiers and civilians killed. These numbers towered over the figures of previous wars, even the Austro-Prussian War, which was fought only 4 years earlier. The outcome of the Franco-Prussian War saw the humiliating defeat and capture of the French emperor who surrendered himself to the Prussian forces. When France lost the war crimes were committed by Prussia on a scale rarely seen in modern history, including the extrajudicial execution of French prisoners of war, the mass rape of French women and girls by Prussian forces, and collective punishment of French civilians during the Siege of Paris. The French were subjected to severe deprivation of necessities, with many subsisting from house pets and street rats, degrading conditions that quickly gave rise to the Paris Commune. Prussian authorities ordered France to pay an extraordinary amount in war reparations, which economically crippled the nation. Prussia would emerge wealthy from France's signing of the Treaty of Frankfurt, but Bismarck pushed for even greater war reparations by demanding the German annexation of the French territories of Alsace and Lorraine. French hatred towards Prussia was at an all-time high. France had lost nearly 5 times as many soldiers as Prussia in the war. Their capital had been raped and pillaged by Prussian forces. They had been forced into starvation for months on end, and were not only expected to surrender their nation's wealth to Prussia, but French territory as well. The demand for Alsace and Lorraine was highly controversial to most Europeans, even in Germany. Karl Marx warned that German annexation of these territories would lead to irreparable animosity. If Alsace and Lorraine are taken, then France will later make war on Germany in conjunction with Russia. It is unnecessary to go into the unholy consequences. World War I would eventually prove Marx's dire prediction to be correct. Not only did France wage war against Germany in alliance with Russia, but furthermore would also seek its revenge against Germany through the reparations demanded by the Treaty of Versailles. However, it was Engels who made the most startling prediction regarding what the growth of the world economy would bring to Europe if socialist revolution did not materialize. The only war left for Prussia-Germany to wage will be a world war, moreover, of an extent of violence hitherto unimagined. 8 to 10 million soldiers will be at each other's throats, and in the process, they will strip Europe barer than a swarm of locusts. The depredations of the Years' War compressed into 3 to 4 years and extended over the entire continent. Famine, disease, the universal lapse into barbarism. The Franco-Prussian War gave an early expression to the growth of imperialism, not only in the scale of bloodshed, but in the underlying causes of the war. France and Germany each sought to form national sovereignty through outward expansion. This was clearly demonstrated in the outcome of the war, which saw the dissolution of the French Empire into a nation-state, as well as the consolidation of German territories under the new German Empire. The German annexation of French territory also clearly indicated Germany's ambition to expand the borders of its nation wherever possible. The Franco-Prussian War was, in many ways, an early indication of what was to unfold in World War I, in terms of the scale of bloodshed, but crucially, also in the underlying causes which would eventually become generalized across Europe in the era of monopoly capital. European conflict and national consolidation continued in the form of the 1877-78 Russo-Turkish War, which pitted Russia and Serbia against Turkey in a dispute over Bosnia and Herzegovina. The Russian-led coalition won the war, and as a result, Russia succeeded in claiming the provinces of the Caucasus. The principalities of Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro, each of which had de facto sovereignty for some years, formally proclaimed independence from the Ottoman Empire after almost 5 centuries of domination. The Principality of Bulgaria also emerged out of the war as an autonomous Bulgarian state. As the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 commenced, other European nations had already turned their colonial ambitions towards territories outside of Europe. In 1876, King Leopold of Belgium established the International African Association, which sought to control Central Africa under a humanitarian guise. Beneath this guise, King Leopold sought to stake a claim to the resources of Central Africa in the Free State of Congo. But he also realized that without any formal agreement between rival imperialist powers, his claim in the Congo would remain insecure. In 1884, the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck gathered the US and European powers together at the Berlin Conference to peacefully parcel out the African continent. The Berlin Conference gave form and expression to the desire of Europe to not only divide up Europe into nation-states, but entire continents outside of Europe as well. The purpose surrounding the colonial partition of Africa was to avoid future armed conflict between European imperialist powers on the continent. European leaders drew lines across a map without any representation or consideration from the African people whose nations and tribes were being carved up. Economic exploitation of Congo resources was the primary concern for King Leopold and Belgian corporations, who enlisted a militia to terrorize the region and enslave the people to mine the country for everything it had. Overseers enforced large quotas for rubber, ivory, and other valued resources, which were extracted by locals under the threat of terroristic violence. In addition to the widespread violence Europe brought to the Congo, it also introduced diseases that wiped out large segments of the population. An estimated 10 million people, or roughly 50% of the Congolese population, died or was killed under King Leopold's bloody reign. In connecting the colonial partition of Africa to European imperialism, the Pan-African Marxist Walter Rodney wrote that imperialism meant capitalist expansion. It meant that European capitalists were forced by the internal logic of their competitive system to seek abroad in less developed countries, opportunities to control raw materials, to find markets, and find profitable fields of investment. The centuries of trade with Africa contributed greatly to the state of affairs where European capitalists were faced with the necessity to expand in a big way outside their national economies. In the period of the notorious Scramble for Africa, Europeans made a grab for whatever they thought spelled profits in Africa, and they even consciously acquired many areas not for immediate exploitation, but with an eye to the future. Each European nation that had these short-term and long-term economic interests ran up its own flag in different parts of Africa and established colonial rule. Meanwhile, the US, left without any formal territorial stake in Africa, was quickly overtaking the Western territory on its own continent. In 1882, as floods of Euro-American migrants made their way westward, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which sought to annex the land and property that had been acquired and developed by Chinese and other Asian immigrants along the western coast. By 1886, the Chinese had become so terrorized that they had virtually disappeared from the west coast, and Euro-American migrants moved in. By 1890, the US Census Bureau declared the closing of the western frontier. Up to and including 1880, the country had a frontier settlement, but at present, the unsettled area has become so broken into by isolated bodies of settlement that there can hardly be said to be a frontier line. While the US had been expansionist ever since the first settlers arrived on the eastern seaboard, the Spanish-American War of 1898 marked a definitive turn towards expansion beyond the territorial confines of the continental US. American imperialism saw that the Spanish Empire was quickly losing control over some of its Latin American colonies, and swooped in to take them over. Puerto Rico, Cuba, the Philippines, and Guam were immediately taken over and incorporated under US control, which was later followed by the annexation of Hawaii, Wake Island, American Samoa, the Panama Canal, and the Virgin Islands. The colonization of the Philippines was particularly brutal. Upon returning to the US in 1901, US General James Bell reported that his men had killed 1 in 6 Filipinos on the main island of Luzon, roughly 1 million people. The effort to introduce the capitalist system of exploitation into foreign lands has never been received with welcome arms, but consistently met with the most hostile resistance. Far from the bourgeois fantasy of capitalism emerging out of a peaceful process of innovation and entrepreneurial spirit from within, the actual history of capitalism shows that capitalist expansion was only made possible through imperialism. Colonization of the Philippines, Hawaii, Cuba, China, and the entire continent of Africa demonstrates that capitalism did not emerge organically from within, but was violently imposed from the outside, coming into the world dripping head to foot from every pore with blood and dirt. There was some debate over US expansionist foreign policy within the ruling class itself, with the strongest opposition coming from the Anti-Imperialist League, which included wealthy and notable members such as Mark Twain, Andrew Carnegie, Samuel Gompers, and George S. Boutwell. The Anti-Imperialist League conceptualized US imperialism as a policy choice that was grounded in a moralistic or legal framework. They argued that the US annexation of the Philippines was wrong because it violated the consent of the governed, a foundational principle of republicanism. Despite its good intentions, the League failed to recognize that imperialism was not a choice based in morality or justice, but a necessity based in economic laws of capital accumulation. This was an error that was quickly rectified in John Hobson's analysis of British imperialism at the turn of the century. British imperialism plainly revealed its economic motives with the onset of the Second Anglo-Boer War in 1899. The war began after a Dutch colony, the Boers, located in a British colony in the mid-southern region of the African continent, discovered a number of large gold deposits. British imperialism, backed by industrial capital, promptly invaded to stake their claim in the territory of the valuable resource, sparking an armed conflict between the two European nationalities on the continent of Africa. Hobson was a correspondent for the Guardian newspaper during the war, and reported on the influence of mine operators in British foreign policy. His contribution altered the theory of imperialism by transforming it from a moral question, characterized by political concerns, to an economic debate grounded in the financial interests of imperialist nations. The decades of imperialism have been prolific in wars. Most of these wars have been directly motivated by aggression of white races upon lower races, and have issued the forcible seizure of territory. Every one of the steps of expansion in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific has been accompanied by bloodshed. Expansion of the empire appeals powerfully to the aristocracy and the professional classes by offering new and honorable and profitable employment of their sons. Hobson understood that imperialism was guided by an economic impulse, but he misplaced the origins of this impulse not in the system of capitalism itself, but in certain policies governing the system. Hobson reasoned that if capitalism caused imperialism through overproduction, then increasing domestic consumption could counteract the tendency towards expansion. In other words, if capitalists found more consumers at home, there would be less desire to expand abroad. Hobson's analysis advanced an economic theory of imperialism rooted in the capitalist laws of competition and accumulation. But without a thoroughly Marxist lens, his economic analysis failed to grasp imperialism as a direct consequence of capital accumulation, and instead, he muddled his analysis with anti-Semitism and calls for reform rather than revolution. The Boer War represented the failure of Europe to peacefully divide the continent of Africa among itself. Not only was Europe constantly warring over territory within the continent, but now European nations were coming into conflict with each other outside of Europe as well. The Austro-Hungarian annexation of Bosnia and Herzegovina from the Ottoman Empire was one of the major conflicts between European powers leading up to World War I. The 1908 Bosnian crisis saw a large redrawing of national borders and carving up of the Slavic nations. In response to the annexation of Bosnia, a rebel group calling itself Young Bosnia formed to organize methods of armed resistance. The group was ideologically mixed, consisting of anarchism, nationalism, and romanticism, but its main priority was to resist Austro-Hungarian rule over Bosnia. On July 12, 1914, the Archduke of Austria Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie passed through the Bosnian capital on their way to the town hall for a scheduled reception. On their way, a young Bosnia rebel waited by the side of the road for the Duke's motorcade to approach, and then hurled a bomb towards the vehicle transporting the Archduke and his wife. The bomb did not detonate in time and instead ended up injuring roughly 20 bystanders, several of whom were in the Archduke's motorcade. After the failed assassination, the attacker made an unsuccessful suicide attempt and was badly beaten by an angry mob. The Archduke may have read this as a sign of support from the locals to carry on with his town hall meeting, which is exactly what he did. After the town hall meeting, the Archduke decided to visit the wounded members of his motorcade at the local hospital. City authorities were on high alert after the first assassination attempt, but en route to the hospital, the Archduke's driver accidentally made a wrong turn down an obscure side road. When he attempted to turn around, he stalled the vehicle, where yards away stood 19-year-old young Bosnia rebel Gavrilo Princip. The young rebel stepped forward as he revealed his pistol, pointed it towards the Archduke, and shot him and his wife at point-blank range, killing them both. Before Princip could carry through with his planned suicide attempt, he was apprehended and charged with murder. At his defense trial, he defiantly declared his anti-imperialist motives for killing the Archduke. "I am a Yugoslav nationalist, aiming for the unification of all Yugoslavs, and I do not care what form of state, but it must be free from Austria." Princip was imprisoned for 4 years before dying of tuberculosis, exacerbated by poor prison conditions which had already caused the loss of his left arm. The assassination of the Archduke of Austria is frequently illustrated by bourgeois history and pop culture as the leading cause of World War I, the match that lit the powder keg of nationalism, militarism, and alliance formation. It is true that European nations ramped up their nationalist rhetoric to encourage the working class to align itself with the national bourgeoisie rather than the international proletariat. It is true that there were militaristic efforts to paint foreign European nations as barbaric, evil, enemies of the homeland. It is also true that every nation pinned the blame for World War I on each other and used the assassination to further their national interests by joining in military alliances. But it is crucial to recognize that these phenomena were only surface-level manifestations of a deeper underlying link that connected and gave expression to them all. A link that evaded all the theorists of imperialism, until Vladimir Lenin. Lenin closely followed the analysis put forth by John Hobson, but departed from him on the ultimate cause and solution to imperialism. Hobson believed imperialism could be combated through greater domestic consumption and placing immigration barriers on Jews. But Lenin understood that capitalism was not a Jewish conspiracy, nor would its tendency to expansion be overcome through greater consumption. Instead, Lenin argued that capital accumulation inevitably required the opening up of the world market, and that greater domestic consumption would never be sufficient to quell the capitalist thirst for the great profits to be made in foreign markets. Fellow Bolshevik Nikolai Bukharin identified the emergence of the world market through volumes of trade from 1900 to 1914. During this period, exports in grain increased from 67 million tons to 100 million tons. Cotton increased from 14 million tons to 20 million tons. Sugar went from 10 million to 13 million pounds. Gold increased from 52 to 91 million pounds. Railroad track went from approximately 700,000 kilometers laid per year to over 1.1 million kilometers. Shipbuilding went from approximately 2 to 3 million annually. Foreign trade for the most developed capitalist nations increased by over 50%, and foreign investment increased by a factor of 7. Lenin understood that mass commodity production and export was produced through newly emergent industries that had monopolized not only their respective national industries, but much of the world market as well. In 1907, less than 1% of German industry employed nearly 40% of the German workforce, consumed 76% of steam energy, and 77% of the electricity. In 1904, less than 1% of US industry employed 26% of the workforce and produced 38% of total output. Only 5 years later, large industry accounted for only 1.1% of industrial capital, but employed 31% of the workforce and produced 44% of total output. Tens of thousands of huge enterprises are everything. Millions of small ones are nothing. This was particularly true with regards to commodity production in key industries, such as energy, transportation, communication, banking, landed property, agriculture, gold, steel, and so on. For instance, at the turn of the century, there were 5 companies that dominated the electricity industry. In 1907, German Union Electric decided to combine with General Electric to cooperatively share in the division of the world market. America got the American and Canadian market, and Germany got much of the European market. By 1912, these competitors merged further, giving rise to a single monopoly in the electricity industry, General Electric. Lenin's conception of imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism was also largely influenced by the German Marxist economist Rudolf Hilferding, who characterized financial capital as an inseparable component of industrial capital. An increasingly large section of industrial capital does not belong to the industrialists who apply it. The right to manipulate the capital is obtained by them only through the bank which in relation to them appears as the owner of that capital. On the other hand, the bank is compelled to place an ever-growing part of its capital in industry. In this way, the bank becomes to an ever-increasing degree an industrial capitalist. Bank capital, i.e., capital in money form, which has thus been in reality transformed into industrial capital, I call finance capital. Finance capital emerged not only in the form of banks acting as middlemen between industrial capitalists, but also in the form of joint stock companies, foreign investment, and state bonds. Finance capital not only allowed industrial capitalists to accelerate the rate of capital accumulation and monopolization by borrowing credit, but it also allowed finance capital lenders to realize surplus value through interest. Finance capital emerges from and comes to take on the reflection of industrial capital, as it too becomes monopolized and exported across the world. In 1907 to 1908, German banks had a total of 7 billion marks. By 1912 to 1913, it increased to 9.8 billion. In this period, the number of banks with less than 10 million in capital decreased in number, while those with over 10 million in capital increased. By 1913, the 9 largest banks in Berlin held roughly 50% of all German capital. In the United States, there were only 2 banks that held such importance, the Rockefeller National City Bank and the Morgan National Bank of Commerce. These banks held exclusive sway over countless industrial undertakings and financial institutions, intertwined in all sorts of ways and functioning as what Bukharin called the monopoly of monopoly making. Beneath the surface of bourgeois rhetoric surrounding the imperative of free market competition, the bourgeois class itself has always held an interest in the process of monopolization on a national and world scale. One German economist, in commenting on the rapid monopolization of the banking sector, wrote that other banks will follow this same path, and in time, 300 men who today govern Germany economically will gradually be reduced to 50, 25, or still fewer. It cannot be expected that this latest move towards concentration will be confined to banking. The close relations that exist between individual banks naturally lead to the bringing together of the industrial syndicates which these banks favor. One fine morning we shall wake up in surprise to see nothing but trusts before our eyes, and to find ourselves faced with the necessity of substituting state monopolies for private monopolies. However, we have nothing to reproach ourselves with, except that we have allowed things to follow their own course, slightly accelerated by the manipulation of stocks. England introduced and developed its industrial capital before any other country in the world, and by the middle of the 19th century, through its free trade policies, became the global supplier of manufactured goods. But in the last quarter of the 19th century, this monopoly was undermined as other countries, sheltering themselves with protective tariffs, accumulated a mass of industrial capital of their own. England adapted to this global competition by using its massive surplus of capital to finance and control the production of industrial capital abroad. In other words, England, followed by France, the US, and Germany, shifted from exporting commodities to exporting financial capital in the form of foreign investment or purchasing foreign debt. As Lenin observed, finance capital, literally, one might say, spreads its net over all countries of the world. An important role in this is played by banks founded in the colonies and by their branches. In 1904, Great Britain had 50 colonial banks with 2,279 branches. France had 20 colonial banks with 136 branches. Holland, 16 with 68 branches. And Germany had 13 with 70 branches. In South America, 5 German banks have 40 branches and 5 British banks have 70 branches. Britain and Germany have invested in Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay in the last 25 years approximately $4,000 million, and as a result, together enjoy 46% of the total trade of these 3 countries. Industrial and financial capital co-constitute the process of monopolization and the circulation of commodities on the world market. Monopolization of industry at the national level is mirrored by the monopolization of finance at the national level, which then comes to connect every nation through the process of foreign exchange and colonialism. Nikolai Bukharin described the push towards nationalization as a crucial part of the process towards the internationalization of capital. Various spheres of the concentration and organization process stimulate each other, creating a very strong tendency towards transforming the entire national economy into one gigantic combined enterprise, under the tutelage of the financial kings and the capitalist state, an enterprise which monopolizes the national market. It follows that world capitalism, the world system of production, assumes in our times the following aspect: a few consolidated organized economic bodies on the one hand, and a periphery of underdeveloped countries with a semi-agrarian or agrarian system on the other. As monopoly capital continued to grow, competition on the world stage grew as well. Wealthy monopolies, backed by banks and the state, struggled against each other for a growing share of the world market. But as the capitalist world system became global, its crises became global, and as its crises became global, its wars also became global. As World War I broke out and spread across Europe, Lenin and a handful of Bolsheviks agitated for armed revolution against the Russian Tsar by turning the World War into revolution and civil war. Alexandra Kollontai, one of the most vocal leading members of the Bolshevik Party on this point, agitated American, Russian, and European workers by pointing to the hypocrisy of bourgeois war propaganda. Who is responsible? Ask a Russian and he will say Germany. She was the first to declare war and therefore she is the instigator. Ask a German and he will say, that is not true, lies. We Germans did not want war. We prolonged negotiations. But the Russian government was the first to declare mobilization. That means the instigator is Russia. Not true, shouts Russia's allies. The Russian government declared mobilization in response to an ultimatum to the demands sent to Serbia by the Austrian government. The instigator is Austria, but Austria points to Russia with England at her back. Remember how over the last few decades, the great powers now at war with each other competed with each other in robbing China, Persia, Turkey, the lands of Africa, and others. And then one thing will be clear to you. For many months, even years before the war, the governments of these countries were striving to outwit one another, conducted diplomatic negotiations while secretly preparing for war. The present war has its own particular cause. This war was generated by capitalism. The major capitalist powers, those who are now at war with each other, all experience the same need for a world market, for colonies. Each power thinks only of how it can bring under its control the colonies and markets of other countries, either by diplomatic deception and by bribing the governments and capitalists in the weak and dependent countries, or by force of arms. The Bolsheviks understood that World War I was an imperialist war and encouraged workers not only in Russia but all across Europe as well to stop killing their fellow workers of other countries and turn their weapons against the capitalists who exploit them and the imperialists who send them off to die in their wars. With their open agitation of the working class and outspoken opposition to the war, it wasn't long before virtually the entire Bolshevik Party was exiled and scattered abroad. By 1917, Russia had suffered a series of military defeats, soldiers were demoralized, and mutinies against officers were becoming more frequent. At the peak of the war, the average Russian life expectancy was 26 years old, infant mortality was roughly 25%, and over 2 million Russians had been killed. In February, widows, mothers, wives, and returned soldiers staged a large demonstration in Petrograd to commemorate International Working Women's Day, call an end to the war, and bread for our children. The peaceful demonstration was met with the utmost brutality from the Tsarist gendarmes as they dispersed the demonstration by firing their rifles into the crowd. After learning of these events, Lenin and other exiled Bolsheviks started making their way back to Russia and calling for the workers to rise up once again. By November that year, workers and soldiers did in fact rise up and overthrew the provisional government, ushering in the Bolshevik Party to power. After the Bolshevik Party took control of the Russian state, it immediately sought to encourage European workers to follow suit. Wars will only end when the power of the capitalists has been smashed, when the owner-exploiters are no longer able to harm the people and push them into bloody conflicts. War is generated by the unjust, inequitable capitalist structure of society. In order to put an end to war, the structure of society must be changed. My enemy is in my own country, and this enemy is the same for all workers of the world. The enemy is capitalism. This enemy is the rapacious, corrupt class government. This enemy is the lack of rights suffered by the working class. Comrade worker, a private in the enemy army, I know now it is not you who are my enemy. Give me your hand, comrade. We are both of us the victims of deception and violence. Our main and common enemy is at our rear. Let us turn our rifles and guns against our real common enemies. Lenin understood that Russia was too weak and too economically backward to sustain its revolution without a broader international socialist movement. The overarching priority of the Bolshevik Party immediately following the seizure of power was to end World War I by supporting proletarian and socialist uprisings across Europe. But while European social democratic parties widely celebrated the Russian Revolution, they were generally reluctant to follow the Bolshevik model of waging revolutionary insurrection. They unanimously rejected Lenin's proposal to wage revolutionary civil war, and instead continued to fight under the command of their ruling classes and struggling for socialism with far less militancy. Not only were European social democratic parties still guided by a sense of national chauvinism that saw Russia as both economically as well as politically and culturally backward, but furthermore, following Karl Kautsky, also naively believed that European socialism could be achieved through evolution rather than revolution. Therefore, instead of World War I coming to a resolution with European socialist revolution, it came to an end through a renegotiation of how to divide up the world market between monopoly capitalists. Nikolai Bukharin noted that if one wants to understand what the war was fought over, one only needs to look at what issues were resolved in order to bring it to an end. The Treaty of Versailles took particular aim at Germany, who was perhaps the strongest economic and military power in Europe before the war. Germany was forced to surrender parts of its territory to Belgium and Czechoslovakia, while France took back Alsace and Lorraine. Germany was also forced to hand over its overseas colonies in China, Africa, and the Pacific to Allied nations. The Treaty of Versailles was presented as punishing Germany for losses incurred by the Central Powers during the war, but had the much more significant effect of crippling the German Empire by turning it into a hyper-exploited, heavily indebted, pacified nation. The resolution of the so-called Great War, or the War to End All Wars, would only heighten the contradictions that caused the war in the first place, and give rise to an even deadlier, more brutal world war only decades later. Marx's most significant contribution was in developing a generalized concept of capital that viewed capital accumulation as an inherent tendency of the capitalist system. He also helped lay the foundation for a critique of the world market by demonstrating how the capitalist system had become global in the emerging era of free trade. Lenin not only built on Marx's conception of the global market, but also challenged earlier conceptions of imperialism that portrayed it as a policy choice, Jewish conspiracy, or problem of underconsumption. He demonstrated that imperialism emerges as a system out of the general laws and tendencies of capital accumulation. The Bolshevik theory of imperialism and World War I is not a theory of militarism or nationalism, but a theory of capital in its monopoly stage, what Lenin called a special stage or the highest stage of capitalism. The theory not only contextualizes the relationship between capitalism, militarism, nationalism, and strategic alliances, but it also constituted the theoretical basis through which the Bolsheviks were able to act, achieve state power, and begin building a socialist society. The Bolsheviks understood that Marxism, with its emphasis on investigating the social and material processes of history, was the key to understanding the reality of imperialism. With such an understanding, the working class could arm itself with the knowledge it needed to fight against its exploitation and struggle for an end to imperialism through socialist revolution. It is not necessarily inaccurate to suggest that World War I was caused by nationalism, militarism, or the assassination of the Archduke. But the problem with such explanations is that they decontextualize the underlying material processes of capital accumulation that are active in the development of all of these aspects. The genius of Lenin's theory is in connecting all of these surface-level phenomenon to an underlying historical process beneath the surface. Capital is the thread that binds these seemingly individual and scattered phenomena into a broader picture that clarifies the cause of imperialism and World War I. Without this crucial context, it appears on the surface as though the war was an almost purely political conflict that can only be understood through individual factors. But when world historic events and processes are framed as the outcome of individual actions, the systemic and underlying causes that give a general character to global crisis can be excluded from the historical narrative. The economic or systemic causes of World War I are rarely included in popular historical accounts, not because they are mundane or dry, but because capitalist media and the capitalist class more generally holds a class interest that conflicts with such a narrative. The effort to obfuscate the structural or systemic causes of World War I are therefore directly linked to the imperialist effort to marginalize socialist theory and politics. The bourgeoisie fear Lenin's theory, and they will never present it as a reasonable explanation of World War I because it points the finger at them and presents implications that are thoroughly revolutionary. Lenin's conception of imperialism was not only revolutionary in theory, but also grounded in the necessity for revolutionary political action. Lenin and the Bolshevik Party did not approach Marx merely as scholars or armchair philosophers, but as students following in Marx's footsteps of waging socialist revolution. The Bolsheviks were committed to an objective understanding of the situation confronting them in order that they could act to change it. As Lenin said, without revolutionary theory, there can be no revolutionary movement. Without objective and accurate theoretical knowledge, it would have almost certainly been impossible for the Bolsheviks to wage successful revolutionary struggle and capture state power. Hardly any other theory in the history of the social sciences has been so definitively confirmed as the Bolshevik theory of World War I and imperialism. The bourgeoisie all across the world understand the threat that working class consciousness poses to its own class interest, and therefore simply will not provide the working class an education of history that will develop its class consciousness. The global bourgeoisie understands the revolutionary content of Lenin's theory of imperialism, and today continues to make every attempt to ensure that the global proletariat does not critique capitalism too ruthlessly or entertain socialist revolution too earnestly.